Every time there is a traumatic event, various schmucks emerge from the woodwork with all sorts of great ideas. Whether they're called the Great Society, the New World Order, the End of History, or more recently the Great Reset, the pattern is always the same. A dangerous mix of naiveté, boredom, petty pecuniary interests, and, yes, evil and totalitarian minds. Sadly, every time some of this happens, the discussion is dominated either by those who focus exclusively on the evil and the totalitarian aspects, or by those who excessively emphasize the naivete, the petty interests, and the boredom, and as if they're somehow mutually exclusive. But they're not. It's all of them mixed together, and that ends up creating such narratives. And it's the same mix that also leads to, well, mixed results, I guess, depending on some other external factors, including public response, lobbyist response, and the trade-offs of the results themselves. All of these eventually shape the societal and subsequently the governmental response, because politics is downstream from culture all the time, not just in some aspects. It's Christmas, so it's a good time to talk about these things, isn't it? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so initially I was thinking about making a point-by-point analysis on the Great Reset narrative, but then I remembered that I already wanted to do that in 2016 and decided against it because it's boring. And it still is boring. Yes, the Great Reset story is not new. It's at least 4 years old, or in fact, if you're looking further back into the narrative, it's at least 17 years old. And the only reason it resurfaced recently is because the author of the story decided to put some more money into promoting it again, using the Wuhan flu as an excuse. In October 2016, on my list of videos to consider making was this article from Forbes titled "Welcome to 2030, I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." Upon further consideration that month, in October 2016, I decided against wasting time on mocking that. Then, a month ago, I was thinking that maybe I made a mistake in 2016, maybe there is a bit more to it. Well, there is a bit more to it, but not in the direction I would have gone to in 2016 if I had made the video that I never made. So I started looking around and noticed that the World Economic Forum, the institution that kickstarted this narrative years ago, suddenly deleted its older tweets. Presumably the newly found backlash at their not exactly new and definitely cancerous set of ideas. And this is the first clue. If this is an organization so powerful and meant to scare you, then why not double down on it? Or at the very least, not cower and keep their tweets up. I mean, if they're so convinced of the greatness of their ideas, why be afraid of some, Twitter backlash? I mean, if Red Bull Incorporated can afford to just right off the bat, fire SJWs and tell them to, buzz off, why can't the World Economic Forum, arguably a more powerful organization than Red Bull Incorporated, or at least with more clout, why can't they? Why aren't they able to tell naysayers like us to just, buzz off? On the other hand, this in itself doesn't mean at all that the Great Reset story is harmless and really just a book written by a bored, wealthy geek. I mean, that's how the media in my own country described Klaus Schwab, a bored, wealthy geek. The YouTuber Economics Explained described the plan as, quote, a victim of its own terrible marketing, and others described the WEF itself as a book club for woke billionaires. Now, notice a pattern here. Basically, they all went straight to the first part of what I described in the intro, namely petty financial or pecuniary interests, naivete, and boredom. As a result, the argument goes, most, if not all, of the concerns about the Great Reset are thus unfounded because you wouldn't want to be a conspiracist, wouldn't you? The same line of reasoning, however, is present in other circles. If you start pointing out that the Great Reset agenda is basically a wish list that really just amounts to certain elements of economic fascism, namely that the government, in conjunction with big industry, are to decide various economic directions with a focus on the billionaires' preferred project of wasting money these days, namely green projects. Now, if you say that, the people in the normie group will call you an extremist. How dare you say that the WEF is fascist? Because sadly, most people have no idea these days what fascism is. Also, if you say this, the people in the more conspiratorial group will call you all sorts of names because you don't believe that the Great Reset is the end of the world. Well, what can I say? The Great Reset is not the end of the world, but it's a hodgepodge of mostly fascistic economic policies that will harm a lot of people and have a negative effect on certain fundamental aspects of liberty, like privacy and property, and should thus be indeed opposed and curtailed and sabotaged both at an individual and at a community level. But this is not the first time this plays out. So before I say anything else about the Great Reset, let's zoom out a little bit and put this into a historical context. Just a few examples, some of them with no results, some of them with marginal results, but also one with terrifying results. Just so we can get an idea about what happens if something like this is taken too seriously or if it's not taken seriously at all. So let's roll back to the month of September 2001. The month of the event now known in historiography as 9/11. Planes grounded, all sorts of grandiose speeches about how tough measures will stop this from ever happening again, yada yada yada. Here's how the New York Times, a former newspaper, was discussing this. Quote, "Air travel resumed across the United States this morning, but it will be some time before things are normal. Indeed, the very definition of normal has changed." Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta announced the resumption of commercial and private aviation effective at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, but the resumption promised to be slow and gradual. "I must caution everyone that a system as diverse and complex as ours cannot be brought back up instantly," Mr. Mineta said in a statement distributed by the White House. "We will reopen airports and resume flights on a case-by-case basis, only after they implement our more stringent levels of security," he added. "This phased approach will assure the highest levels of safety, which remains our primary goal. Travelers must expect much more stringent security and should therefore allow more time before scheduled flight departures," Mr. Mineta said. "From this day forward, we are operating with tighter security," the secretary said at a news briefing. "There will be more security officers at airports and cars near airports will be more closely monitored," Mr. Mineta said. And nothing in these remarks suggested that the changes are temporary. On the contrary, it seemed clear that air travel will be different from here on because of the hijacking of 4 jetliners on Tuesday and the accompanying destruction of the World Trade Center and the attack on the Pentagon. Mr. Mineta asked Americans to be patient and cooperative with security people. Close quote. Now, this article alone created more conspiracies than the whole of 2020. Now, was any of that needed? No, not really. So why did it happen? Well, because the plebs panicked. And on top of that panic came in a lot of naivete, petty pecuniary interests, and yes, evil and totalitarian interests as well. The naivete is that one could have prevented an attack like 9/11. No, you could not have prevented that. The petty pecuniary interests are visible to this day, namely all of those bureaucrats and legitimately non-essential workers that Americans know by the name of TSA. Also, in the petty pecuniary interest, you can throw in the various companies that made those body scanners that were rolled out in 2002 or 2003, or the ones in 2009, introduced after another incident, and many of them were largely scrapped 10 years later. By 2013, most of those were out, but it took that long to take them out because that's how much it takes to beat an entrenched bureaucratic interest. Now, on the evil and totalitarian interests, you can throw in the Patriot Act and all of these subsequent acts. Speaking of the Patriot Act, it only went away this year, just 19 years later. Did it solve anything? No, of course not. But the point was not and is not to solve anything, just like virtually none of the policies adopted with the occasion of the Wuhan fluff solved anything, because that's not the point. But sticking to 9/11, the press of the time was full of very familiar phrases like the new normal, it will never be the same, air travel will be lowered because it's unsafe, and so on and so forth. And for a while, that is to say for about a year or so, the narrative worked. Here's a Gallup article from September 2002, a year after 9/11, describing how the populace still felt about air travel, mail, and things of that nature. Quote, roughly a quarter of Americans say they have handled mail differently since 9/11, and 1 in 5 say they have traveled by air less as a result of the attacks. Of those who say the latter, fully 55% attribute their decrease in flying to their concerns about safety, while just 16% say they are flying less because of the added security hassles. Other behaviors, such as stockpiling supplies or avoiding travel to certain cities, are less prevalent. Just 15% nationwide say they have avoided certain cities since the attacks, and fewer say they have stored up food or water or stockpiled medication or prescription drugs. Not surprisingly, worries about terrorism are highly related to these behaviors. Almost half, 45% of those who are very worried that they or their families might become victim of a terrorist attack say their life has changed in a major way, and 84% say their life has changed at least somewhat. By comparison, 61% of those who have little or no worries about becoming a victim of an attack say that their life is basically the same as it was before 9/11. The minority who have high levels of personal concern about terrorism, 12% of the public, have changed their behavior dramatically. 7 in 10 are staying closer to home and spending more time with family as a result of the attacks, and half are handling mail differently. A third have reduced their air travel plans, and roughly 4 in 10 are avoiding certain cities and crowded places. Among those who are very worried, 1/4 have stored up food or water in their home in case of an emergency. Just 7% of those who are not worried about an attack have done the same, close quote. So that was a year later. The story of nothing will ever be the same still sort of worked, although even only a minority was still on board of the story, on board with the story. Here's a graph that shows that the lowest point of September 2001 in air travel was hit again in February 2003, and things really stayed pretty low until the second half of the year 2003, when eventually most had just moved on. Okay, so this is an example of a reset, right? It wasn't a great reset, but it was a reset with meh results. Now let's give an example with terrifying results. Here's a nice clip, I'm sure many of you already know, of George Bernard Shaw, a Fabian socialist and a playwright recognized as second only to Shakespeare in the British theatrical tradition.
I object to all punishment whatsoever. I don't want to punish anybody. But there are an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill. Not in any unkind or personal spirit. But it must be evident to all of you, you must all know half a dozen people at least, who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. And I think it would be a good thing to make everybody come before a properly appointed board, just as he might come before the income tax commissioners, and say every 5 years or every 7 years, just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? if you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social boat, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us and it can't be of very much use to you.
Ouch! It also didn't help that he went on and, quote, appealed to the chemists so that they find a, quote, humane gas, deadly by all means, but humane, unquote. This was in 1931. Now, of course, Bernard Shaw personally isn't responsible for the fact that just a few years later, a certain Austrian-born German dictator decided to put this into practice. But Shaw's point went pretty much unnoticed at the time because of two things. One, most people were concerned with the recession, and two, most of the press was busy with the things done by Shaw that were perceived as good, namely his plays, which apparently were quite good, though I personally disagree largely because I'm not a big fan of any playwright, really. And perhaps there is even a third reason. Everyone knew that Bernard Shaw was kinda silly, because, well, he was kinda silly. His wit was great, sure, but as a man, he was silly. And he liked to joke a lot, and it was hard to tell when he was serious and when he wasn't. Does that sound familiar? Most people are concerned with the recession today. Most of the press is busy with the things said and done by the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab that are perceived as good, namely the green projects, which many people perceive as a good thing, though I personally disagree, largely because I don't want anyone to be intentionally made poorer, just so some soy boy in New York feels better about himself as he's sipping his latte. And perhaps there is even a third reason. Everyone knows that Klaus Schwab is a silly, bored geek with too much time on his hands, because he is silly. Now, do you see where I'm getting at? So, the point that I'm trying to make is that ignoring such ideas can have terrifying results, like it was the case with Shaw's ideas. Or it can have temporary inconvenient results that may or may not drag on for longer than they should due to bureaucratic corruption, inertia, and incompetence. So ignoring such ideas is a bad thing, but treating them as if they're the most important thing can also have negative consequences. And here, the best example that I can come up with is 1968. 1968 is the year when many protests took place all over the world, most of them left-wing, but not exclusively. Now, in retrospect, it is clear that the governments overreacted in multiple countries, like it will be clear in the case of the Wuhan flu today. Funny enough, the only place where the management turned out better was exactly where the protests started, namely in France. Well, in a way it turned out better. I mean, Charles de Gaulle did lose his seat after all. Anyway, what I'm saying is that if the 1968 protests had been treated with less importance at the time, their effects on culture and politics would have been narrower than they actually were. For instance, the 1968 protests in Sweden eventually ended up creating the political class that helicoptered the economic leftists who were crippling the country. So in effect, by sponsoring the leftist protests, the leftist government, always eager to be part of every global and globalist claptrap, ended up creating a bourgeois political class explicitly against it. And really, if you look at every country that had protests in 1968, things were made worse by the governmental intervention, because too many people in the establishment panicked and treated it as if it were the most serious thing imaginable, when it really wasn't. In 1968, many of the speeches sounded similar with the Great Reset, except it wasn't technology that was the great thing, though it already had the green overtones. Most of what they demanded was rendered obsolete by the sheer technological evolution, but also by the sentiments of the 68ers themselves. Though on different timelines, most 68ers did not remain so 5 years later, because, well, because short attention spans are a thing, you know. Or, let's say 1989. You know, most of the people in the West think of the fall of the Berlin Wall as the moment, but in reality the 1989 moment in fact starts from around 1987 and lasts until about 1992. Millions and millions and millions of copies of a book called The End of History and The Last Man were sold then, and Francis Fukuyama suddenly became a relevant figure rather than what he should have been, namely a marginal geek. What he did basically was to take advantage of a story about the 1989 moment, which, by the way, 1989 was kind of a great reset moment. I mean, many geopolitical relationships were resetted at the time. Fukuyama just made a good story out of it. And like most so-called public intellectuals, of course, he paid no price for being absolutely and entirely wrong. But, unlike Klaus Schwab, at least he didn't promote a message that would harm people directly. He merely promoted a message that was simply wrong and amplified the confidence of certain people who should have known better. Yet, just like Klaus Schwab, the end of history narrative was one of the changes deemed so fundamental that they would be not just irreversible, but that would alter human nature itself. Ouch. Well, tough luck. That's not how reality works. Nevertheless, the elites at the time, as well as the useful idiots and the normies who wanted to serve a new cause, because everyone wants to be part of a common something bigger than themselves, they all swallowed the end of history hook, line and sinker. I remember meeting some of those in the latter category in the 1990s. They would come around here in the Intermarium and were utterly surprised to learn that, you know, taking down commies is a much more difficult process and that these things take time, and political universalism, already heavily taught in universities, is not just unworkable, but indeed undesirable. Speaking of which, at some point I'll have to make a video about political universalism, because that's one of those bloody recurring fallacies. Anyway. So, to sum up this aspect with the historical perspective. Ideas so great that they got good PR and ended up being either terrible or irrelevant is not something that started in 2016 or 2020, and it's not something likely to ever stop for as long as humans are a thing. Now, back to the Great Reset. Maintaining a balanced approach is not easy, but it is mandatory if one wants to be effective in countering it. For instance, I tried to introduce talking points against the Great Reset into the platform of 5 political parties in Romania. 2 of them outright rejected the idea of talking about this because they thought it's a far-right idea. No, seriously. One of them rejected the idea because the leftist wing of the party kinda liked the idea behind the Great Reset, and 2 of them agreed to introduce it, but then ended up dialing up the crazy. And you have to remember that the crazy comes from at least 3 sources. One of them is the generic conspiratorial mind, and for that, see the video that I made in February this year about this aspect. The other one, the second one, comes from the supporters of the Great Reset itself, who, of course, would love to see anyone opposing them discredited. And the third direction from where crazy comes from is from what I usually call agents of chaos. Now, an agent of chaos is someone who intervenes in a dispute solely to create destruction, or at the very least disruption. I know, because sometimes I myself am an agent of chaos, especially when I believe both or all sides of a dispute are wrong and I can't convince any of them, so chaos is the second best option. Anyway, when I say crazy, I mean things like the chain email that circulated quite a lot in various bubbles, various social media bubbles, the chain email claiming to be from a member of a non-existent committee within the Liberal Party of Canada, in which it was claimed that the Great Reset means the forgiveness of all debt in exchange for forfeiting one's property rights. Now, that's the kind of crazy that can easily discredit any wise opposition to the Great Reset. Now, don't get me wrong, the idea of a certain left-wing political party trying to at least shrink, if not outright abolish property rights, that's believable. But forgiveness of all debt, nah, you're never going to see that. So, that's a red flag right there. But there's also crazy from the other side. For instance, the claim that various media outlets have made that it is impossible for a secret cabal to exist in order to push a dirigiste type of economy. That's also from the crazy arsenal. Or as Wikipedia claims that it is crazy to believe this because the World Economic Forum can't tell countries what to do. Well, I mean, sure, yeah, it doesn't have to be secret, and in the case of the Great Reset, it's definitely not secret, since all of the proposals and memberships are out in the open and public knowledge. And yeah, sure, technically speaking, the WEF itself is an institution that doesn't have the legal or the legitimate power to tell countries what to do. But so what? I mean, the World Economic Forum's main event has 3,000-ish attendees from over 100 countries and include presidents, vice presidents, or prime ministers of the biggest nations, chiefs of organizations such as the UN, the WTO, the World Bank, the OPEC, the Wuhan Honk Organization, the International Labour Organization, NATO, OECD. You get the point, right? Plus, of course, the CEOs or VPs of major corporations and also the leaders of the so-called civil society, such as the Greenpeace, the Archbishop of Constantinople, New Roman Ecumenical Patriarch, the Vaccine Alliance, Occupy Wall Street, and yes, it still exists, and yes, it was present at Davos this year, the European Trade Union Confederation, and so on and so forth. All of these, and many, many others, have attended at the event after which the Great Reset story was resurrected. Again, the story itself is not new. Please do keep that in mind. So, whenever you argue against the Great Reset, whenever you're told that it's not a conspiracy, you should agree. Yes, it's not a conspiracy because it's public information. But just because it's not a conspiracy doesn't mean it should be ignored. It also doesn't mean it's not wrong or harmful. And just because the WEF itself doesn't have the legal backing to tell countries what to do, it doesn't necessarily mean that it cannot be done. I mean, really, you don't have to be an expert in propaganda, politics, or economics to understand that if you gather the most important heads of state and the most important chiefs of corporations and the most influential organizations all in one place and get them to agree on something, that means you got to tell countries what to do. Sure, it doesn't mean that in the eyes of the law, but so what? There's a reason terms like de jure and de facto have survived to this day. Just like when I have a meeting with a committee chair in the parliament and I submit to him or her a piece of draft legislation. Sure, technically speaking, the parliamentarian writes the legislation. It is then assumed by the political party in which he or she is a member of, and if it becomes law and being amended multiple times, then it becomes known as an act of parliament supported by that political party. Very technically speaking, at the end of the process, I, the main lobbyist who drafted the law, didn't get to write legislation, even though 70 to 90% of the final act is mine, and I attended multiple insider discussions in order to persuade other parliamentarians to support it. But very technically speaking, I didn't write legislation. The same is true here. Yes, very technically speaking, the World Economic Forum doesn't tell countries what to do, but it kind of does. So, now that we know that neither dismissing it nor treating it as the most important thing in the world are good approaches, what should be done? Well, the answer is roughly the same as it was following 1968, 1989, or indeed 2001. more politics, not less. From the lunacy of 1968 emerged leaders such as Reagan, Thatcher, Georges Pompidou, Reinfeldt, or yes, Pinochet. Through politics, not through whining that they couldn't outright flatten the lunacy in a few days, although, in fairness, Governor Reagan did just that. He was such a boss. 1989 also did not bring the end of history, but did bring the largest expansion of prosperity in the history of mankind. Yes, really. 2001 did not bring an end to air travel and perpetual fear and surveillance because of a terrorist might be around the corner or behind the next bush. Pun not intended. Air travel last month, for instance, with all of the restrictions, was higher than in November 2018 or 2019 in the United States, and higher, much higher, than in November 2001. The same can be true now as well. 2021 doesn't have to bring the Great Reset or some other great something imagined by various naive geeks or evildoers or both. It can bring that, sure, but only if enough of us stop doing politics or continue to refuse to do politics. No regime and no change can occur without the consent of the governed, says the theory, but the opposite is also true. Namely that a regime or a particular change can be installed if the governed don't care. In other words, a regime doesn't necessarily need the affirmative consent of the governed. Their apathy is just as good. Besides, this period is great for politics. A much larger share of the public is ripe for a populist message or a national conservative or whatever you want to call it. Now, if you followed my advice back in April, now you should be right on track. If you haven't, it's not too late to start now, though you will be a bit behind the curve as you've missed a few opportunities. Get your own organization up and running. Put your people into other organizations. And most important, don't stop campaigning. I mean, I've seen quite a few, well, non-leftists just giving up after losing an election. Like, what the hell? Come on, really? That's in a way an opposite kind of extremism. While lefties, progressives, and so on and so forth, they do treat politics as their religion and as the sole aspect of their identity, or at the very least the dominant aspect of their identity, sadly, too many non-lefties go to the opposite extreme by leaving politics altogether. You will not see any representation of your ideas if you're not willing to work for it. Many of the terrible ideas over the last really 150 years or so became dominant, although briefly, solely because reasonable people who knew better decided not to engage, or decided to engage but to limit their engagement much below their potential. The same will be true in 2021. Those who engage will reap some benefits. Those who don't won't. That easy. So, do you want the Great Reset? And what's their slogan? Build back better? If yes, then don't engage. Entropy is on their side anyway, as always. If you don't want it, however, then you will have to engage. In a smart way and by avoiding the lunacy from all sides. The enemy is not Klaus Schwab as a person. The enemy is apathy, techno-optimism, green leftism, and the revolutionary mindset. Remember when we were supposed to have retinal scans at the airport? It was announced as a great feature of the new normal in January 2013. Now, not only none of that happened, but it is less likely to happen now than it was in 2013. Why? Because enough people, known to the press as privacy advocates, refused to bow down to the inevitable progress and continued to engage rationally but firmly. Get yourself acquainted, by the way, with the privacy advocates. They will be great allies in sabotaging the Great Reset story. So will be all of the various nationalist and populist political parties, and of course, mayors and city councils. People tend to forget that all politics is local. Ursula von der Leyen can scream "Build Back Better" as much as she wants. If the mayor, and to a certain extent your regional prefect or premier, says "No, you buzz off," there's not much anyone can do. Or for our American friends, keep an eye on the state legislature and the mayors. Almost always, that's where capital T trouble resides. I mean, Joe Biden or Trump or Kamala Harris or Obama, they can say whatever they want. If your state and local legislature said, "Yeah, no, you buzz off," then nothing is done. Our older American friends might remember that in 2009-2010, the Tea Party effectively conducted an economic secession of the Republican states, a move which may be repeated in 2021, I'm just saying. But what I am saying is that one shouldn't look at these things gripped with a sense of fatality. Because at the end of the day, things like the Great Reset or the New World Order, remember that? All of these things are stories. And that's it. They only stop being stories and start having consequences if only the fans of the story get to play. Because, sometimes ideas have people, as our friends in Germany would say. All right. So, really, that's all I have to say about the Great Reset. The end is not nigh, the sky isn't falling, but everything is not honky-dory either. An idea entering into the masticator of politics is not a fatality. Worse ideas have been into the masticator of politics and will be in the future as well. Politics in this aspect is kind of like football. There's always the next season. So with all of that said, I wish you all a Merry Christmas. I hope you're throwing a party to make the panic cards screech and the Great Resetters sigh. Many thanks to all of you who have been continuously supporting our work. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.